presentation. Oh. So I actually I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen. There we go. Okay. We're gonna do slideshow from All right, bear with me, folks. Looks like it is still loading. There we go. All right, can at least one person confirm that they can see my screen? Verbally, please.
Yes, I can
Confirmed.
see it. We can
Okay,
see it.
awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so good evening, everybody, again. So I am Maria Misova. I'm an attorney with the Washington Lawyers Committee. I'm here tonight with my colleagues Hannah and Nadia. They also work with me at the Washington Lawyers Committee. And this evening, we're going to be talking about how to protect yourself during encounters with the police. First, just a little bit about the Washington Lawyers Committee. We are a legal civil rights organization, and we focus our work in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And our mission is to create legal, economic, and social equity through litigation, client and public education, and public policy advocacy. We partner with individuals and communities facing discrimination and with the legal community to achieve justice. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to share our contact information as well, just in case you want to reach out to us after the presentation or anytime in the future. So our main areas of focus are workers' rights, housing, police abuse, education, disability, and prisoners' rights. Of course, our clients are not one-issue clients, meaning that the issues that folks face that we work with often cut across the different issue areas that we work with, and that means that all of us work closely together. And tonight we're going to be talking both about police abuse and housing. So we're going to focus on what folks should know to keep themselves safe when they encounter police sort of in the streets, and then within their buildings, and then again within their units, within their homes. And finally, before we get started with the substantive portion, a reminder that this presentation is not intended and it is not legal advice. This information is being provided for educational, civic, and advocacy purposes only. So for legal advice that's specific to your situation, you should definitely contact an attorney and speak with them one-on-one.
Okay. So just a couple reminders before we kick it off. The purpose of this presentation is to keep you as safe as possible. Interactions with law enforcement are disorienting and stressful. It can be challenging to remember the particulars of what an attorney told you about what your rights might be when the situation is actually unfolding. And so the primary goal is to keep you safe. And one way you can practice in advance is to practice, and it can sound a little silly, but saying out loud some of the things that we'll talk about tonight. Am I free to go? I wish to remain silent. And we'll talk about that in more detail, but you know, going back and forth with a friend, saying it in the mirror. Again, it sounds silly, but if the first time you're in a situation to say those things, it can be hard if the first time you're actually trying to say them is when you're interacting with law enforcement. And you don't deserve to be harassed or mistreated. You don't deserve to have your rights violated. But what we're going to talk about tonight are situations where you're put in situations where that you shouldn't be in. So we just want to have that baseline reminder.
So some context for this presentation. As you may have noticed, it's been hard not to notice, there have been a lot more law enforcement around DC recently in the past few months. So that's because in August, President Trump signed an executive order declaring a crime emergency in DC. This triggered the deployment of federal law enforcement officers and then also activated the National Guard and also placed our local police, MPD, under federal control. ICE also became much more aggressive in DC. So ICE agents started conducting random stops of individuals who oftentimes are not doing anything wrong. And federal forces have also started to clear homeless encampments around the city. The status has sort of been evolving. It is continuously evolving. But right now, as far as we understand, the National Guard are still here through November and also potentially longer. I read on the news today, even though the federal emergency has technically ended. In cooperation between MPD and some federal law enforcement remains ongoing.
Okay, so we'll first start by talking about your rights in public, out on the street, and then we'll move on to talking about your rights inside your building and then inside your home. So we're kind of going from the outside in. So starting in public, if police officers approach you, the law categorizes what might happen into 3 different buckets, and each of those have different rules that the Constitution imposes and different rights that the Constitution gives you. The first is contact. Officers can approach you and ask you questions. That's pretty much always true. There aren't really limitations to whether officers can walk up to you in public and start asking you questions. We'll talk about what to do if that happens. The second is a stop. If officers have reasonable suspicion that you have committed or will commit a crime, they can temporarily detain you. And then the third is an arrest. If officers have probable cause that you have or will commit a crime, they can arrest you. So that's the kind of broad legal framework. And if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about what actually to do in practice. So the first thing that we want you to say if an officer comes up and starts talking to you is, am I free to leave? If the officer says yes, turn and walk away. Don't run away and don't say anything else. You're not required to stay and answer any questions. You should just turn and leave. It's not unheard of for an officer to kind of try to get a rise out of somebody to see if they can get you to say or do something. Just turn and walk away. If you're free to leave, you should leave. That's the easy version. It gets a little more complicated if the officer says, no, you are not free to leave. If you're not free to leave, then you're being stopped. And you should stay, you have to stay there until the officer says that you may leave. During a stop, the officers are allowed to pat down the outside of your clothing if they have reasonable suspicion that you're carrying a weapon. And I'll say reasonable suspicion is a fairly low bar generally. The courts have interpreted the Fourth Amendment to give officers pretty wide latitude under the reasonable suspicion standard. And that's just a little unfortunate lawyer backdrop. So if the response is you're not free to leave, you're being stopped, you have to stay there, and you should be aware that the officers are likely going to pat down the outside of your clothing. So if you're stopped, you're not free to leave. The next question is, am I under arrest? If the answer is no, ask again if you're free to leave. If you're being stopped but not arrested, the officers have limited powers. They can stop you for only a discrete amount of time, and they can pat down the outside of your clothing. But they don't have the authority to do as much as they would as if you were under arrest. But if you ask, am I under arrest, and the officers say yes, then that's kind of the most serious situation. And we want you to ask, what charges am I being arrested for? And then say, I want to speak to a lawyer, and I will remain silent. And that's the extent of what you should say, with the exception of providing your name and address if officers ask. So that's, it's a somewhat complicated decision tree, but when in doubt, if you don't remember very much, am I free to leave? And if the answer is no, am I under arrest? The answer is yes. I want to speak to a lawyer, and I will remain silent. In terms of what not to do, don't escalate. No sudden movements, no touching, no pointing. And even if you think that an arrest, a search that the officers undertake, or really a stop, kind of any point in that decision tree that I laid out, even if you think it's not legally justified or you think your rights are being violated, don't physically resist, because that will open the door for the officers to potentially take actions that could hurt you. So it's very frustrating to know your rights, but know that in the moment they're being violated. But like we said at the top, the primary goal of this presentation is your physical safety. And if something happens where you think your rights have been violated, call us and you can talk to the lawyers after. But in the moment, the most important is your physical safety. Second thing, remain silent. Next slide. Remain silent. I want an attorney. I will remain silent and name and address if asked. And officers can lie to you. That's allowed under the Constitution, under the law. There's nothing preventing officers from lying to you. So if, it would not be unusual for an officer to try to elicit some statements from you by telling you something, if you tell me X, I'll let you go. I believe you. It seems like maybe your friend got into trouble, whatever it is. It's not in your interest to take their word for it. It's also not in your interest to offer any explanations or excuses in the moment. Anything you say can and will be used against you, right? And absolutely no lies, and certainly no fake documents. Less is more in this context. If you do have something that, you feel like you can explain, maybe there's been a confusion, you can have that discussion after the advice of a lawyer with the lawyer in the room. It's always best to have that guidance, instead of kind of freestyling on your own. Okay, next slide. One more thing I'll tell you not to do. Don't sign anything. Don't sign anything without a lawyer present, and don't sign anything you don't understand. That could be a waiver of your rights, that it could be very challenging to get those rights back after you sign it. Okay. And a common and sensible question is, are my rights different when I'm interacting with MPD or other local agencies as opposed to federal agents like ICE, National Guard members? What about all of these federal agencies that now have a bigger presence in DC? And the answer is no, your rights don't change. Your rights are not dependent on the agency of the officer that you're interacting with. Your rights are yours. The Constitution gives them to you. But you should know that officers can arrest people for suspected immigration violations if either the officers have a warrant for that arrest or if they have probable cause, which is kind of lawyer speak for a good enough reason to believe that the person is in the United States in violation of immigration laws, and the person will flee before a warrant can be obtained. And those kinds of arrests are most frequently carried out by ICE agents, but not exclusively. Many other federal agents have been deputized by ICE and work with them. So if you have reason to be concerned about being arrested for a suspected immigration violation, just because somebody isn't wearing an ICE uniform doesn't mean that they might not try to execute that kind of arrest. And then finally, if you are a bystander, you're at a protest or you're just out on the street and you see officers interacting with somebody and you want to pay attention, right? Be a responsible bystander. You have the right to record the police. Officers cannot confiscate your phone, and they can't demand to see the video, to look at your device without a warrant. They also cannot delete your data. So if you are taking a video of a police interaction, the officer comes up to you and wants to look at your phone, look at the video, delete the video, you're within your rights to say, no, they need a warrant to see your phone. You also have the right to talk about and publicize information that you obtain lawfully, including what officers are doing and where they are doing it. So if you look out your window and you see officers on the street, and you want to tell people on social media or in a group chat or whoever you want to tell what you're seeing lawfully, you're allowed to do that. You're also allowed to inform people of their rights. If you want to go talk about what you learned tonight about your rights, you are absolutely allowed to do that. What you don't have the right to do is interfere with police activity. And generally in practice, what that means is that if officers ask you to step back to give them more space, do it, even if you think the command is unlawful. That will help keep you safe, avoid physical confrontations, and generally although you're allowed to protest and do everything that I just laid out, the line stops at interference with police activity.
All right, thank you, Hannah. So now that we've talked about what folks should do if they encounter law enforcement out on the street, we're gonna focus in a little bit and narrow this down to what folks should do if law enforcement is in their building or trying to get into your home. So first, just to address some concerns that we have heard about specifically from people recently. We've gotten some questions about public housing specifically, given the way that it is funded, at least partially by federal funds. Folks have been wondering, does that give law enforcement, federal law enforcement, more power over them? And the answer is that public housing tenants have the same constitutional rights as anyone else. So officers don't have any special powers to stop or extra powers to question you or arrest you just because you are located in public housing or just because you live in public housing. Like Hannah said, your constitutional rights are your constitutional rights. So first, let's talk about the common areas of your building because there are differences between your rights in the common areas versus your rights within your home. So when I say common areas, I mean things like hallways, stairwells, the lobby, the laundry room, right? The gym, any common spaces of your apartment building that like people from the outside could access. If you encounter a police officer or other law enforcement in those common areas, your rights are the same as those that Hannah described as your rights are on the street. So you do not have additional rights just because you are inside of your building, because the common spaces are technically still considered public. So then the special protections afforded by the Constitution begin when you are actually within your home, so within your apartment unit or your house. I also am sure that I don't have to remind many of you that the way that things are supposed to work with respect to rules for law enforcement are oftentimes not actually how things work. With respect to public housing residents in particular, the site of police patrol is probably pretty routine, right? And the police probably take more liberties than they would at a building where like super wealthy people live. Like that is just unfortunately the reality. Um, and the law generally allows the police to stop public housing residents for really virtually any minor infraction, even things like lease violations, if the housing complex is considered to be in a high crime area. So just wanted folks to also be mindful of that. So when can police actually enter your unit or your house, right? There's three different types of circumstances. So the first is if you give them permission. The second is if law enforcement has a warrant signed by a judge, and we'll talk about what that looks like. And the third is if there are certain emergency circumstances. So some examples can include like somebody is seriously injured, somebody is about to be seriously injured, in imminent danger, evidence may be destroyed, or the police is in hot pursuit of somebody who is, they have reasonable suspicion has committed a crime. And I do want to highlight one additional important point here. That in these slides, we're obviously talking about law enforcement, so like MPD, federal law enforcement like FBI, DA, etc., right? The requirements for their entry into your unit are very different than your landlord. And I just wanted to highlight that, right? Generally speaking, your lease will oftentimes contain a paragraph about when your landlord can enter your unit without your permission, usually in the case of an emergency. So if like your landlord smells gas, or if there's like water leaking into the unit below, your landlord can just go into your unit to try to fix whatever issue is going on. And DCHA rules for public housing specifically state that DCHA is allowed to enter anytime without advance notice if there's an emergency. So if police are knocking on your door, here is what you should do. First, don't open the door. If you do open the door, the police may try to push their way in and act as though you let them in. So don't open the door. Instead, ask them, who are you? So they should identify themselves through the door. Ask if they have a warrant. If they say yes, ask them to show you the warrant either by sliding it under your door or if you have a mail slot, if you have a window or a peephole, however you can review it. And then say, I do not consent, right? Tell them explicitly that you do not consent for the police to come into your home without a warrant. If the police is asking you questions through the door, right? You still have the door closed, but they're asking you questions. Remain silent, and say that you are invoking your right to remain silent, right? Say that out loud. Do not offer more information. Do not answer questions, including about who is and who isn't home, right? Like Hannah said, the police can lie to you, right? For example, ICE can claim that they're the police investigating a crime. So it's just very important to invoke your right to stay silent in that situation. So, as we discussed, one of the ways law enforcement can enter your home legally is if they have a valid warrant, right? So, how do you know if it's a valid warrant? So, first, if the police has like slid it under your door or through a mail slot, you should take a picture of it. You should take a picture of anything, any documents the police show you. Then try to figure out, is the warrant signed by a judge, right? If it is not signed by a judge, then this is not a valid warrant for the police to enter your home, and the police still need your consent unless there's an emergency situation. If it is signed by a judge, you should check that the warrant is for an address or a person. And I'll show you examples of what those look like on the next slide. But some things to be on the lookout for, right, is the address like your address? If no, you should let law enforcement know they have the wrong address. If it is for your address, that means, and it's signed by a judge, this means it's a valid warrant and the police have the authority to search your house for the items listed in the warrant, and you should let them in. If the warrant is for a person rather than an address, right, is that person in your home? If no, you should let the cops know that the person listed is not present. If yes, have that person go out of the home and be arrested because that is, if it's a warrant signed by a judge, and it's for a person who is inside your home, that is valid. And note that the police can enter if they have a reasonable suspicion that the person listed is in fact in your house. So here are just some examples of what these documents can look like, and we're actually showing a picture of a court warrant versus an ICE warrant. And we wanted to highlight some important distinctions between the two as well. So for the court warrant, which is on the left-hand side and has all the blue highlighting, so at the top, or near the top, you can see that that's where you would see a person or an address listed, right? Also near the top, it should say the name of a court that is issuing this warrant. There should be a date somewhere on the warrant that says like it's only valid until that date. And then near the bottom, right, you should check for the judge's signature. An ICE warrant, on the other hand, that's what's being shown on the right-hand side with the red highlighting. So an ICE warrant does not give ICE permission to enter your home. An ICE warrant is issued by ICE or the Department of Homeland Security, not a court. And the warrant is going to be signed by an ICE officer and not a judge. And so there's a couple different places on the warrant itself where you'll be able to hopefully tell the difference between the two. So if the police are inside of your home, a couple of things you should and should not do. So if they are in your home, without a valid warrant, you should say that you do not consent to the search. If the police, however, do have a valid warrant, then they can search your home without your consent. You should say, again, you want to remain silent. That's definitely a theme. You should keep saying that. But you should take notes, right? Observe what the officers are doing, what they're searching, and what they take, if anything. You should write that all down for your records. What you should not do is answer any questions or offer any information. This is similar to what happens if you're arrested on the street, right? But you should also not interfere with the search in any way. And you should not run or make any sudden movements. And then finally, if you are arrested within your home, this is going to look a lot like what happens if you are arrested on the street, which Hannah already covered, right? So again, say you want to remain silent, you want to talk to a lawyer, do not answer any questions or offer information or explanations unless your lawyer is present and you have talked about that with your lawyer. Do not sign anything unless your lawyer is present. And don't talk about the case with anyone, including on the phone, because police can listen to phone calls with anyone except with your attorney. With your attorney, there's a special privilege that protects those conversations, but not with other individuals. So finally, I also wanted to address marijuana in public housing, because I know that that's also something that is a question we get and people frequently wonder about. So the tricky thing, right, is that marijuana is decriminalized in DC, but federally it remains illegal. So that sort of gives DC sort of some tricky rules to be aware of. And federally funded housing programs, like for example, public housing, if DCHA is your landlord, their rules prohibit marijuana use on the properties. So, and if police or law enforcement have reasonable suspicion that you have marijuana in building common areas, they can stop you. Remember, ask, am I free to leave? All the things that Hannah talked about, right? But if marijuana is found on your person, obviously, that can lead to being prosecuted, but also potentially eviction, even if no one is convicted. The last thing, though, to be aware of is that the smell of marijuana does not give law enforcement the authority to enter your unit without a warrant or your consent. So that is the end of our presentation. I'm going to put our contact information on this slide. I will leave it up, but I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that anybody who has any questions can feel free to ask. Oh, this is not what I meant to do. Hang on. I stopped sharing my screen, not recording, I think.